Hello and welcome to Module 4, Video 2, Animation Basics for IN158 3D Animation 1 at Butler Community College. I'm your instructor, Jon Simpson. We will be rigging and animating a game of chess. When we rig geometry for animation, we are creating a control system that keeps the animation separate from the geometry. It is good practice to keep the animation separate from the geometry in case we need to modify the model, change it out altogether, or whatever. But there will be times when you will animate the geometry or modifiers directly. For instance, if you want to animate a property belonging to a modifier currently on the geometry. Almost every property in Max can be animated. We will look at the basics of animation in Max in this module and explore it more in future modules. We begin the rigging process by looking at the model and determining which parts will be moving. Looking at my pawn, we see it consists of three editable poly objects: the pawn itself, the sword, and the shield. I want my pawn to be able to move and have the sword and shield move with him, while still maintaining the ability to move the shield and sword in combat. The gizmo represents the position, rotation, and scale center for the selected object. You may need to reposition the pivot point for an object by going to the Hierarchy panel and clicking Effect Pivot Only. Reposition the pivot using the Align tools or the gizmo as desired. The simple control structure we are going to build will be made up of helper objects called dummies. In the Create Helpers menu, there are many helper objects to explore and learn, like the tape helper that measures distance. Choose Dummy. We create a dummy by clicking and dragging in a viewport. A dummy has no properties in the Modify panel and will not render in the image. If you need to resize the dummy, always resize using the Select and Uniform Scale tool. Click in the middle to scale the helper object on all the axes uniformly. Another concept you need for rigging is parent-child relationships. A parent object controls the position, scale, rotation, and other properties of a child object. If a parent object is moved, scaled, or rotated, the child object inherits this modification. The child object can be modified individually without affecting the parent object. In this example, the rig I am going to create will consist of three dummy objects. Use Shift Drag to create two copies of this helper object. The first dummy will control the entire rig. The second two dummies will control the sword and the shield. If needed, resize the dummy to better fit the model. Remember to do this uniformly. Going to the Hierarchy panel, I reset the pivot point to be on the minimum of the first dummy object. You don't need to do this, it's just a preference of mine for the main controller dummy. I use the Align tool to align the main dummy to the pawn at the pivot points. Learning this tool takes practice, but it is a most useful tool and worth the time to master. The next two dummies are scaled and aligned to the sword and shield respectively. Once aligned, it is now time to create the parent-child relationships. From the main toolbar, choose the Select and Link tool. It looks like a chain. Using this tool, select the child object, in this case the pawn geometry, and drag from it to the parent object, in this case the big dummy aligned to the pawn. Test the relationship by switching to the Move tool and moving the parent object. If the child object moves as well, the link was successful. If not, open the Schematic View from the main toolbar and inspect your linkage. The Schematic View shows the parent-child relationships in a graphical manner. Repeat the process for anything else that will be animated. Once the geometry is under the control of the dummy objects, it's time to link the two small dummies to the big dummy. Using the Link tool, select the two smaller dummies and drag from them to the big dummy. Switch to the Move tool, select and move just the big dummy. If you linked everything correctly, all the pieces of the pawn should move. If everything moves with the big dummy, select and move the smaller dummies to test their linkage. Don't forget about the Schematic View if your linking does not seem right. If all the links are correct, then double-click the big dummy. This will select all the children and grandchildren objects. Shift drag to make a copy of the rig and the geometry. Select all the geometry and right-click in the viewport to open the quad menu. This gives quick access to many common tasks in Max. Find Freeze Selected. This will lock the geometry down and keep us from selecting it. Move the rig by selecting the big dummy. Move the sword and the shield by moving their dummies. Now we move on to animation. Please review the playlist in the description for a primer on animation principles and ideas. What I am presenting here is a crash course on creating simple animations in 3ds Max, not a complete lesson on animation. Animation is best described as change over time. That means some property of the object, its position, scale, or some other property must change over the course of time. In Max, we can measure time in frames per second, or FPS. There are other ways to measure time in Max, but we are going to focus on frames per second. The bottom of the interface is where the timeline is found. By default, Max gives us 100 frames to work with. The slider above the frames is called the playhead. Click and drag to scrub the playhead to move through the animation. A common FPS for animation is 24 frames per second. 24 frames equals 1 second. 100 divided by 24 is 4 with 6 left over. With 100 frames, we have just over 4 seconds of animation. Moving to the right, we see a large black key and the words Auto Key and Set Key. When we animate, we make changes to the object's properties like position or modifier values at different points on the timeline. Max stores these changes in keyframes. We set the keys and Max creates the frames between, creating the illusion of movement. We will return to these buttons soon. Next to that is the default Tangents button. A tangent determines how Max will interpret the pacing of the animation. More on pacing in future modules. For now, make sure the straight line is selected. This is called a linear tangent. The pacing of the animation will not change from start to finish. Next is the Key Filters button. We will look at the Key Filters button shortly. To the right of that are playback controls for viewing your animation. And finally, the button that looks like a calendar and a clock is the time configuration window. Here we can set properties like frame rate and length of the animation. To set the frame rate to 24 frames per second, select Fill. Next to this is the time display. Set this to frames. Below that are options for playback speed. It can be helpful to watch your animation in slow motion or reverse. To give us more time to animate, in the animation section we can set the length of the animation. For 10 seconds I would set the length to 240. 24 frames per second times 10 seconds equals 240 frames total. Click OK to confirm your options. Once you have set and confirmed the options such as frame rate and number of frames, it's time to animate the model. The two buttons marked Auto Key and Set Key will enter us in animation mode. When either Set Key or Auto Key is active, a red border will appear around the active viewport. The main difference between the two modes is simple. In Auto Key, any changes are automatically recorded. When using Set Key, we must click the large key icon to save the changes. Additionally, if we open the Key Filters dialog, we can selectively tell Max which properties to record. For now, I will be recording only the X, Y, and Z positions. Begin by activating Set Key. Select all the objects you want to animate, position the playhead at frame 0, and press the key icon to set the initial position, rotation, and scale of the object. 24 frames equals 1 second. Move the playhead to frame 24. The action I'm about to create will take 1 second to complete. Select and move the main dummy object to its new position and add a keyframe at frame 24 by clicking the key icon. Scrub the playhead between frames 0 and 24 to see your animation. What is happening is that Max looks at the keys we have set and then repositions the dummy object for each frame according to the tangent selected earlier. With a linear tangent, the object moves the same distance between the frames for the entire animation. The dummy object is the parent object, so all the children move with it. Next, I will animate the secondary motions in the animation. I'm going to do this the correct way first, then show you a common mistake made by beginning animators to help you avoid making it yourself. Note, you will only see the keyframes for the currently selected object. The correct way. Determine when the animation should start. Place the playhead on the correct frame and click the key icon to place a keyframe. Now move down the timeline to when the animation should end. Modify the object and create the keyframe. Scrub the playhead. The animation starts and ends at the appropriate times. The incorrect way. The mistake many beginning animators make is not setting the second keyframe to hold the object's properties. Observe. In attempting to create a similarly timed animation, I skip setting the second keyframe and go directly to setting the end keyframe by modifying my object and setting a keyframe. Upon scrubbing my playhead, it can be observed that the animation begins at frame 0 this time. Max only knows what we tell it. Turn off animation recording mode by clicking Set Key. Continue this process for all the different objects that need to be animated. Animation is hard work and takes much dedication to master, but it is supremely rewarding. I encourage you to invest the time needed to learn and master animation. We will continue to explore these concepts, rigging, control systems, animation, keyframes, tangents, and so much more in future modules. For now, happy modeling and animating.